Hello, 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 and welcome back to Tea.Coffee.Water. I am your host, Natalie Poindexter, and welcome back to another episode with coffee and with Michelle Vryn. I am so excited to have you back, and I am even more excited. I feel like I'm going to get a ton of education from this because we're talking fundraising. We are talking, and I'm not just saying a little bit about fundraising, like we are talking to a fundraising subject matter expert, and she is going to school us, give us some insights, some interesting pieces that we can take from us, and then also some things that you can do on your own after our show. And so thank you for coming back, Michelle.
Absolutely. I have my coffee and water this time. So we're good to go.
I love it. I was gonna say, like, strap in, y'all, buckle in, get your beverage, play this. Maybe don't play this with everybody else. I was like, play this in the office. Don't do that. Not yet. Listen first and then do it again. And so I was thinking about how to introduce this conversation. And as someone who is more on the grant and business development side of things, when someone says they are a fundraiser, I mean, what in the world does that actually mean? Because I feel like there's this like a jumbled version of fundraising, business development, grant writing, grant management, donations, expert. There's just, what does it mean when we say fundraising, and how did you become a subject matter expert in the fundraising world?
Oh my gosh. So two really good questions to kick us off today. I hear you on like, what does it really mean? Because we have so many like jargony terms and some of them like have overlap and some of them don't. So let me do my best here to make it all clear.
Okay.
So as a nonprofit fundraiser, I am really tasked with one, being able to tell the story of that nonprofit mission and why it's important. So I really feel like there's a huge marketing piece to fundraising, which you'll hear from me, I'm sure, many more times in this episode. But two, you're also executing on not only telling the story, but finding people who could potentially be interested in donating, which we call these people prospects. They haven't donated yet, but they could.
Okay.
And so you're telling the story, finding prospects, but also building relationships with donors and prospects and what I like to call just stakeholders, right? Like community stakeholders, people who, may not give you a $5,000 check, but they should be in your nonprofit ecosystem. And so all of that kind of boils down for me into the nice phrase of I'm a professional relationship builder. That's how I like to think of myself.
Love it. I love, and if you all were listening to our previous episode with the introduction, we talked about relationship building, and as you're saying right now, it's key. It's something that you don't get to do just one time. This is something that you have to continue to do. And so, yeah, how do you, and I don't mean to cut you off. I know I asked multiple questions, but please, if there are, please continue. Yes.
Yeah. I mean, so I guess like, how does one get into this? There's this phrase now, which is so overused. I probably even find it annoying at this point, but I'm going to say it. We all like fell into fundraising. Fundraising wasn't really like this neatly delineated career when I was in school. Although I remember when I was in graduate school, the certified nonprofit professional certificate or designation, a CNP after your last name, was becoming like more of a popular thing.
Okay.
And so I do think for like, if you're in school now and, you're at a college or university, there's nonprofit minors typically, and there's also like degrees as well, which wasn't a thing like when I was in school, but I'm glad to see that, we're kind of formalizing things. And so I think that formalization piece becomes really important because as the nonprofit sector begins to mature, so does the field of fundraising, just like any field, right? Like whether it's physics or economics, like the older the field becomes, just the more mature it gets and it kind of figures things out. And so the fundraising field is definitely, I think, going through growth and change, some good, some bad, but we're definitely evolving, and probably one of like the newer professionalizations, which is, probably cause for some of the confusion around the profession as well.
That is, I'm like, I think about how I started in nonprofits, right? And I was like, I started as a volunteer. And I know we'll talk about that in another episode, but I felt like it made me feel like I was doing more, but I didn't understand until I was on a grant committee what it really meant to like have relationships and sit around the table and know things about your community, because we were a grantor, right? And so we had applications that were coming in, and a lot of what would happen is, we would review these applications, but then we would sit around the table and do our process planning, right? Of like, okay, who's moving to the next stage? Who do we need some more information from? And it was all about the relationships we built within the community. It was like what we knew about this group, this nonprofit from X side of town, or whatever it was that they were doing. And I even think now, and I think this leads me into my next question of the strategic plan, right? And it's not just your organizational strategic plan, it is also your funding structure of your strategic plan. And I'm curious, how do you approach that? How do you like create that connection? Do you, I should say, create that connection? Or is that like a duality between you and someone else? Because that is a conversation that I think more nonprofits are actually having now, but I don't know that they're having it together.
Yeah, there's room for improvement there. So I'll start off by saying that maybe we zoom out a little bit and ask the question of like, how do you know where you could even get money? Like a more simple question like that. And I think, because of the term nonprofit or not for profit, many people really assume that nonprofits can't make a profit, which is false. You can make a profit. So you can take in more revenue than your expenses. And like, not only can you, but you probably should. Like, that's a good thing to carry over more revenue year to year. So let's just like dispel that myth from the foundation here of this conversation.
Yes.
And also, not all nonprofit revenue coming in is philanthropic. And what I mean by that is, so philanthropy is what you really think of as like donations, right? Like whether it's from a corporation or a government grant, like those are donations, and those are always philanthropic. So there's no transaction. So like, for example, when you go to H&M and you buy a t-shirt, like that's not a philanthropic transaction. Like you're getting a t-shirt for the $20 you gave the cashier. Yes. So in philanthropy, like you're not getting anything tangible back. I mean, of course you're getting like great feelings of generosity back, but you're not getting anything back. So we said nonprofits can make a profit. They should make a profit each year, but also not all of your funding has to be philanthropic. And let me kind of dig in and tell you what it can be instead. So there's earned revenue, which we are very familiar with in nonprofit models because of entities like Goodwill, for example, right? So Goodwill has their thrift stores. I love going to Goodwill. I have some of like my most favorite outfits. Like, where'd you get that? I'm like, Goodwill. She'll probably never find it again. I'm sorry, But Goodwill, for example, here is it Goodwill of Central Texas? Yes, is the name. Like most of their revenue comes from the stores.
Okay.
In this area. So I would say it's like somewhere between 60 and 70% as of, a couple of years ago. It could have changed. But so that means 70% of their incoming revenue is earned revenue. So that's significant to really think about. A lot of times when you think about nonprofits, you don't think about them earning revenue for things. But, like museums, for example, they have membership fees. That's going to be an earned revenue source. but you could also just make a straight donation to your favorite museum. That would be a philanthropic donation. So when we talk about strategy for nonprofit success and resilience and how development and fundraising fits into that, I don't want us to always just think about philanthropy. Like, you can make really good earned revenue too.
That's so interesting. I learned about this probably 5 years ago. And I didn't know. I mean, that was, and I had been working in nonprofits for about 5 or 6 years at that point. And it was about, it was a nonprofit in Florida, and they were using, they managed properties, but it was a part of their like homeowners program. And so they ended up like owning these property, they built and owned the properties they used. And it was just all based on programs that they had within their nonprofit entity, right? Like they had a trades program. And so like the folks that were enrolled in their trades program needed hands-on experience. They did the building, they did the electrical, they did the plumbing, right? And so it was like, it was a direct connection to their mission.
Yeah.
But they also took in money. And I mean, the money obviously that they took in was going right back into their home ownership program. But they were able to get like other funding from city, county, other area, like construction manufacturers. And I was blown away.
Yep.
I didn't know it was an option.
There's some really complicated revenue strategies, right? And like one really simple one, which I think we all will know what it is, it's an earned revenue strategy, is the Girl Scout cookies, right? Like they make so much money off those cookies.
Cookies, oh my gosh.
And I mean, and I feel like I just cannot say no to these young girls because they're such good fundraisers, So as a professional fundraiser, I'm like, okay, that overview you just gave right there was so great. I'm not gonna take the cookies because I'm trying to watch my calories, but here's $20, so it's really helping them with their leadership skills. But that is an earned revenue strategy, which has worked so well for Girl Scouts, right? So kudos to them. So I think this is always something I love reminding nonprofit professionals of, is like, think about other ways to be creative. One other thing that comes to mind for your listeners, if you have kids, you often may place your kids in a summer camp that is a nonprofit school, or I'm sorry, a nonprofit. And I used to work for a nature center in Houston. And so we would do summer camps, most nature centers do. And that's an earned revenue, right? Like, so you're enrolling them in summer camp. That money is going to a nonprofit entity, but it's not a philanthropic donation. Like your kids are, getting entertainment for a week. So there's a cost associated to that. So just keeping that in mind, like when you think about your strategic fundraising plan, it can and should, I think, include earned revenue if it makes sense. And like you mentioned, is mission aligned and really gets people involved more in your mission.
Yeah. No, I didn't even think about summer camps. Like I was that nature camp kid that was learning what I could eat and forage, in the in the parks in Columbus, Ohio. And so I know we had talked a little bit in our planning sessions around like data with Michelle. Are there, and I think that sharing these trends around fundraising, and I think that's it is a strategy, but I feel like that earned revenue piece is like a secret to success.
Yes.
Because like you can absolutely, from what I'm hearing, right, create a revenue stream based on the work that you do within your nonprofit.
Yes. Yeah. And so there's a really interesting article by the Nonprofit Times. I believe this came out in 2020, so there may be an updated version, but the article showed that when you look at all of the nonprofits in the US, right? So on average, the average nonprofit in the US, about 40 to 50% of their revenue is earned revenue, which is like shocking, because I think we typically don't think of like any kind of earned revenue scheme for a nonprofit, but there's a lot out there that are doing it and doing it well. So we'll drop that in the show notes for sure, the link to that article. So that's one thing to know, is like, not only is it a thing, but it's working well for a lot of people. So, always keep that in mind. But more data on philanthropy, I'll kind of talk through the highlights first and then talk about the source, is there is always a report that comes out each year showing like how much is given annually in the US. And the entity that does this research is called Giving USA, and they've done it for like a couple of decades. So there's like a view of trends here now. And we know like each year around $470 billion is given in philanthropic donations. So like putting earned revenue aside, we're moving just into philanthropy now. So about $470 billion is given, which is like, it sounds like so much. It sounds massive. It sounds massive. And so I give this presentation, so I know these statistics very well, on if you look from like the 1970s, each decade to decade, like 80s, 90s, 2000s to where we are today, it shows like an increase in the number of cumulative giving and donations. And you look at that and you think like, that's amazing. Like we're giving more and more each year. But in fact, the ratio of what that total contribution is to the total GDP has really never exceeded 2% of total GDP.
Wow.
Which is interesting because there's a lot of theories on like why that is. So if you want to get really nerdy and academic, you know, you can go look at like some research papers on why people say total charitable giving never exceeds 2% of GDP. But for me, I think the take-home message is this abundance versus scarcity mindset, which you mentioned in the previous show, that there's so much more that can be given. Like just because we haven't broke 2% of GDP doesn't mean we can't. And there's a lot of money out there, right?
Yeah.
Like,
yeah.
So I'd like to remind people of that, of anything's possible. You know, like there's so much money.
Yes.
So just don't ever think that, oh my gosh, like I just have scraps and I don't know, you know, like how to make it. Just remind yourself that there's actually enough for everyone, because hopefully charitable nations will rise beyond 2% of GDP at some point. But we'll put a link to the Giving USA results for so this will be the year of 2022.
Okay.
So you can look at that. It's like there's so much data, like you can really get lost in it in a good way. But feel free to check that out on your own time.
Yeah, and I think I love what you said about there's just so much money out there. As a minority business enterprise, I'm a part of my regional council, and we had the opportunity to sit with some of the funders. And when I heard these dollar amounts that are accessible, I just had it took my, I mean, still to this moment, like for anyone in the transportation world, right? Like in Texas, transportation world in Texas, there is about $15 billion of funding coming out 2023, 2024, 15 billion. That is, they have to give, I think, like 30% of the 5 billion to minority business enterprises. And I think part of the conversation that we've had relating this, and not even I think, I know, it's education. Yeah. Because there is so much funding out there. For women-owned businesses, for nonprofits, there's so much funding out there, but that means you have to have the capacity to find it. You have to have the capacity to write it. You have to have the capacity to get that information out in like 30 to 45 days. And so I hear you when you say this, like abundance versus scarcity mindset. And I'm curious, you know, when we talk about how to transition our mindsets in that space from people who do fundraising, right? Like I don't do fundraising your way, but I do fundraising in a different way. And I talk to these small businesses, nonprofits, whoever it is. And they're like, well, what happens when I don't get it? You know, or what happens when that big donation doesn't happen? Or that they said they were going to get 50K and now they're only going to get 15K. What then? And I feel like that instead of what then conversation, usually what I say with the grant world is, we are not making one grant application because we're not chasing money. We are creating a proposal based off of the programs you have in place And then we're pitching that to multiple organizations. It's no different than a startup. You have your pitch deck, your proposal, your grant proposal is your pitch deck, right? And so how, thinking about that from that perspective of like, when you have a funder who, or a prospect who's like, yes, Michelle, 50K it is. And then they call you 3 weeks later and they're like, so what we really meant was 15. What is your conversation then? How do you either, I mean, obviously you're not going to say no to the 15K, right? But like, how do you transition that scarcity? Like, oh shit.
Yeah.
That's a $35,000 deficit. How to we got 15K, and that is, yes, that is what we needed right now, and we are going to move forward in this abundance moment.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel like for me, the action steps happen before that conversation happens. And this is a good business practice, whether for profit or nonprofit, of like, we really need to intentionally diversify where our funds are coming from. Because when you have all of your eggs in the government funding basket, for example, it's more vulnerable.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that there's real reasons why people don't have diversified revenue streams. One being, it's more work because you're building relationships and managing very different kinds of funder audiences. And I think that I almost think of them like with different personalities, like people, like they're very, how you connect and build relationships with them is very different. And because we're typically under resourced, you're doing good just to have like a great funding program for individual giving, let alone like individual giving and corporate and foundations and government grants. Like that's a lot, like to really take on, like, in a healthy way for each type. But I do hope that people can find some comfort in the statistics I'm going to share. And this will be also linked in the Giving USA report. So you'll immediately see this. It's kind of like one of the biggest takeaways. So let me just give like a high level recap. So different types of revenue for nonprofits. You have earned revenue, which would be like the Girl Scout cookies example, or Goodwill. You have philanthropy revenue, and also like there's like this government source revenue, which technically is under philanthropy. However, government also has contracts, which are not grants, but we don't have to.
The procurement world.
The procurement world. So within the philanthropy slice of this, it's important to diversify who you're talking with and seeking funding from, but also know that 70% of all philanthropic donations come from individuals. So there's about 3 or 4 different types of funders in the philanthropy world. We have individuals, which are by and far the most. We have foundations, which is going to be like your Bill Gates Foundation, your Rockefeller Foundation. Here in Texas, we have like Houston Endowment. You also have corporations. And then there's this 4th category, which we talk about in bequest, which is really planned giving or gifts that are made upon someone's passing, which in my mind, I also calculate that like under an individual umbrella, because it's individuals, passing away and leaving you in their will. But if you're struggling to think, how do I diversify my current earned revenue? I really implore you to think about 70% of all charitable donations come from individuals. So that's why we talk so much about establishing an annual giving program, which is really just a program internally that is looking at how to attract donations from individuals. So that's going to be like your Giving Tuesday campaign, your end of the year giving letter, whether you mail it or have like an online campaign, peer-to-peer fundraisers for like bike rides, for example, or something similar. So all of these are, donations coming from individual people. It's not donations coming from corporate or foundations. It's just individual people like you and me. And I think we always discount how much value can come from building those kinds of relationships, from just individuals. You know, we tend to think, well, you know, what's Bank of America doing? We need to ask Oprah for money. You know, I mean, like our minds go there. But really, most donations are coming from individuals.
Mm. And do you, I mean, I'm with the current state of our economy right now, where everyone is like, what in the world do we do? Just from your, this doesn't have to be with any data, but your just personal thought process of what does that do to that individual giving?
That's a great question. So let me kind of set this tone here with one of my early experiences in fundraising. So I actually learned how to fundraise at a university. So I started out in fundraising at my alma mater, UT San Antonio. And at the time, we were in our very first capital campaign. So universities typically go through capital campaigns like on a, you know, cycle, like it's like almost like you're always in one practically. But UTSA is one of the smaller schools in the UT systems, smaller, not necessarily smaller, but newer schools.
Okay.
And it was our very first capital campaign we had ever done. And I believe the goal was 21 million, I think, if I'm remembering correctly. And so you have like dozens and dozens of people working on this, right? So it's not like just me, like you have like 150 people like on the development team, which that's a totally different experience in your small nonprofit, right? But I remember we achieved that goal. I think we set out to do it like in 5 years, but we did like in 2 or something incredible like that. And you were like, oh my God, like how did that happen? Like, why did we actually do it so quickly? And when you looked at the gift list, right, in the database, it was all of these smaller gifts that got us there. It was people who, you know, so UTSA is traditionally Hispanic serving institution. There's a lot of Latinx folks there, including myself, who go there. There's a lot of veterans who go to that school. So it's like a non-traditional school, which I love. Shout out to all Rogue Runners listening in on the call today. But the take-home message for me was the amplified power of these smaller gifts.
Okay.
And when you juxtapose that to like campaigns, like for example, at Rice University, which they have like, they often have like billion-dollar campaigns and they meet those campaigns, but they're coming from mega donors, right? But like at UTSA, it was just so many $1,000 gifts, $500 gifts, $50,000 gifts. Like, it's not like you had someone come in and just give like $25 million and it was over. Like, it was just the power of all these individuals who resonated with what you were doing. You were like, I'm going to be a part of this first campaign. And I think honestly, you know, when you're planning your very first capital campaign, you almost like don't expect that because you're kind of, you'd rather extend it out and then take time to meet it than like, you know, like
knock it out and early.
Knock it out. Yes.
Yeah.
And I think even we didn't see that coming, like how many people would donate. And so I hear you on the economy. And I think a lot of people, understandably so, may have donated 5 years ago, but maybe not this year. But I think when you diversify and you're attracting a lot of people to your mission, that does help sustain you a little more and make you a little less vulnerable.
I think of the, as you were saying that, there's a St. Jude's commercial, and one of the folks on there, the donors on there, you know, they said like they create their monthly budget and like that donation is within their monthly, but it's a bill.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not, there's no conversation around it because they believe in what St. Jude's is doing so thoroughly, right? And like I think that's, yeah, I didn't even put it into context, right? As you were explaining, people are still going to give.
Yeah.
They're still going to do it.
And you're moving us to such an important point that I'm glad you flagged, because it's really critically important. Is not only is there a lot of conversation around you need to create an annual giving program in your fundraising shop at your nonprofit, but also within that that annual giving program, you need to think about monthly giving. So you should definitely have monthly giving as an option on your donation page because of what you just said. Like a lot of people, they just want to budget it $10 a month. You know, like that's what we do. We don't think about it again. Like, and there's really interesting research on the lifetime value of a donor, which is basically how much they would give over their lifetime projected, obviously. And the lifetime value of a donor is like 70 to 80% higher for those enrolled in monthly giving, because they never in the subscription, basically, like they just keep giving. So if you gave once a year, like December, 30th, and you're going to give like whatever, a $500 check or $100 check, sometimes you forget, like you got to mail the check, you got to put your credit card out, you're like on vacation and you just forgot to do the donation online, whatever. But with monthly giving, because it's so steady, the value of a lifetime donation, it's just more. And so always like trying to think about, one, making it easy to do monthly giving, but make sure in your communications, you're flagging it for people. Like, did you know you can become a monthly donor? That's so critical, especially if you have a lot of people who may be attracted to your mission.
And I have one last question before we roll up this conversation. I recently have been having conversations with other women business owners who, and I had a conversation at a SCORE women's business conference, and she was a banking representative. And I got on my stair step and I was like, women are getting less than 1% of VC funding, or 1% of VC funding, and minority women are getting less than that, right? Less than half. And I don't understand why the banking industry is treating us this way. And she was like, thank you. I appreciate that feedback, but let me correct you. It's not that. It's that women aren't pricing themselves to be competitive. And so their long-term profit, right, their revenue stream is shot before they even get to us. And I've had this conversation with other women, right, where we're like, well, $50 is fine. It's okay. It's going to take me 12 hours to do this, but I don't want you to break your bank to pay me for something that took me so long and is going to be beyond what you actually asked for. And we have to change that mindset of like, no, we are valuable.
Yep.
You have to pay us for our, like, we are worth more than $100 or $50 for a thing that you wouldn't blink twice about if it came from, a McKinsey or something of that sort, right?
Yeah.
And so I'm just curious, right? Like relating that back to the nonprofit world of how do you have any advice around, encouraging higher amounts from monthly givers, or just in general, right? Like, how does someone broach that conversation or change that mindset of, well, I can't ask for more than $500, but I know we need 1,500.
Yeah.
I don't know. Does that?
No, you're totally tying these threads together, and I'm understanding where you're coming from too. I think a lot of it in the nonprofit space in particular is what you said, is be bold about your value, right? Like, you are creating an opportunity for someone to give to something that they care about. So that's often like a misconception, with being a fundraiser. Is I think a lot of people will say, to me, I've had this said to me, I mean, literally like at least a dozen times, like at parties and stuff, like, oh, you're a fundraiser. I could never do that job.
Wow.
And it's like, well, you're not like twisting people's arms and making them donate. You're creating an opportunity for people to give to something that they care about. And if they don't care about that mission or doesn't resonate with them, that is 100% fine. Like, it's not like you just continue to spend time with that person and try to get them to donate. Like, you can move on, like, to other people who may be interested. Yeah. So with that as like a base layer statement, I would say on monthly giving in particular, I do feel like some people, I've remember like conversations like with some CEOs of smaller shops that they'll say, but I'm not sure, like, is that rude to ask? It's like, well, I mean, I don't think on your donation form, which I think we can all visualize this, you have like the different levels of donations, and there's usually like 4 or 5 bubbles that you can pick from. I mean, I don't know if I would make the top one like $500 if that's like way above your average gift. But if you know your average gift size, which is easy to pull from the database, right? They just do it for the past 12 months because, to your point about the pandemic, things have changed a lot. So what if the average gift size is $35? then, offer amounts around that. Maybe don't start with like $1,000 donation for, at the top, but you want people to feel comfortable interacting with your content for sure. But I think the key is, if you know people who are your ambassadors, who are cheering you on, like, you do know some things about them. What do you think, like, those giving levels, what would make them feel comfortable with those giving levels? And it is very different, right? Like, if you're going to donate on a Harvard University donation form, it's different than if you're going to donate to One Star where I work. So know, like, your audience for sure. But also, I think that there's a lot of value when you're talking about monthly giving. Maybe in your e-newsletter, you're doing a shout out to the monthly giving opportunity. Talk about having that consistent revenue month to month also helps with operations, right? Like, every business knows that, because like, this is going to come in, versus where you were speaking, Natalie, on the point of, it's hard to plan for stuff that's really big dollars like government grants, and then it doesn't come in. So that monthly giving is the heartbeat of your operations too. And tell people that, like, honestly, so many people are business people out there. They probably work in a business, or maybe they own their own business. They get that. So don't be afraid to say things like that in your messaging, to position it as a really valuable opportunity.
That's amazing. Yeah, I think just from being in other conversations with, like, other women, right? Like, just having that, I love what you said about being bold. And having those conversations around, like, being your authentic self. When you're having these when you're talking to prospects, stakeholders, whomever it is, like, I had, and even with starting this podcast, right? Like, someone was like, oh, when are you going to start? And it was like, well, I have to plan, and I have to do these things, and I have to do this, and I have to do that, and I have to do this. And then I had this moment of like, it is never going to be perfect. That is the reality. People are going to tell me no, in, relation to, like, taking this back to the other side of, when you're talking about funding, and you, like you said, if they want to give, they will. Right. That is it. Like, that is the end of the story. Some people you may have to encourage a little bit, right? But then, like, if they get it and they're already at the door, right, here's my check, you don't have to push them to continue to do that, right? They are, like, already showing up for you. And I think that's just, like, right, all of these different avenues, aspects, experiences, it's showing up as your authentic self, right? And also, like, coming through with the knowledge, right? Like, coming through, like, why do you need this money? And it's like, well, great question, right? And you know exactly why you need that money, versus like, well, we have this idea and we think maybe it could be the right thing. And so I would probably not want to write that grant or fund whatever that is, right? And so, like, making sure that you're coming through with your research, your, using the links that we post after this show, right, to go through it and look at trends and use that as a conversation starter. I think it's just super powerful, you know?
And I think we're saying, like, know your value proposition and have that at the ready, because any business owner, for profit or nonprofit, like, we all know that. We know what that means. Like, you have to be very clear in what is it that I'm offering, what change am I making that is of value.
No, that's, I'm laughing because I feel like I asked someone recently about my business plan. And she's going to do some work with me on this podcast for, folks who need, like, truly just, like, reviews of their business plans. And I had my value proposition statement, like, when I say red line, I mean, it was, I don't know. I was like, you sure there's not one word in here that was good, And so it was just this moment of, like, one, I had to humble myself that not everything I do is just right at the first time. But two, like, let me take this information from this expert. And I'm like, I think that just is another reason why doing this series with you, and how we're even, like, spoiler, notice, like, doing another series together, because it's just like, if people don't know, right? I didn't know that you could go and now have a minor or major in nonprofit management. I thought that was
Mhm.
still a certification, right? And so like, if you know that that is where your heart and your passion is at, maybe that's where you start recruiting folks. Hint, 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 hint. In the nonprofit world, there are students coming out with these degrees, and you need new employees that, or you need like interns, or you know, someone that is willing to volunteer with you, right? There, like being able to make those connections, and having someone who was like, no, I am in it, I get it, I am giving you my knowledge in this brief period of time, so that you can be successful, so that you can grow, so that you can make an impact. And I think that just goes back to previously when we were talking about passion.
Yes.
You know, like we are doing this because we are passionate about having this conversation, one, and then two, right, like getting this information to as many people that are available to to improve what they're doing. And so I feel like every time we talk, Michelle, I am learning more and more. Like, thank you. Thank you for educating everyone, including myself. But yes, so our next episode that we are going to be doing is going to have a special guest, and I am so excited to have that conversation. I don't know if we're going to do which topic first, so I don't want to like promise the listeners something, but it's going to be great. It is going to be, I think, very energizing because we get to just kind of let our hair down a little bit, which will be very interesting when you meet Greg because he's not letting his hair down. Just as I thought about that out loud, like that was not gender appropriate. But in the big picture of things, yeah, we're just going to continue having this conversation. And then our next episode, we have a couple more coming up, still talking about planning, about strategy, about sustainability. And our last one, I just have to keep hyping it up because I can't wait. Like that is going to be like the most exciting one for me, of the education and access. I don't, we are going to try to stay on topic and on time for that episode, but I can't promise. I can't
Yeah.
promise anything.
Yep.
Yes, and we might, I don't know, we might have to figure out how to be in the same room together, because I think that that synergy will just be the thing we need to have happen. So thank you so much for coming and joining me again. Thank you for everyone that is listening. If you know anyone in the nonprofit space, if you have any questions, please feel free. I will have all of Michelle's information in the show notes. So if you want to follow her, if you want to connect with her, however she allows you to connect with her, it will be there. And I just look forward to seeing you all virtually, obviously, but connecting at our next episode in a week. So thank you so much for joining us on Tea.Coffee.Water. Thank you so much, Michelle, for being here.
So much fun. Thank you.
Absolutely.